And Aditya and Prabhu, do we have the recording on, please?
Sorry, Mati.
Recording, yes, it just started, so that's good. So yeah, and Her Grace Rambo Mataji. There are no words that can come out really befitting the service that you're offering. Aditya and Prabhu has mentioned all those, and if I have to put that in one word, and from what I hear around, it's just not me feeling this way. Mataji, you have been a blessing to ISKCON because the emotional health that was never really brought up front so much is beautifully brought into focus, both from a scientific standpoint and the essentiality, the component, how important it is for us to actually acknowledge that component and for us to move forward in bhakti. So that wave of emotional health, I have seen around the courses that you were offering. So that was clearly visible. So for that aspect, a huge blessing to ISKCON. And Srila Prabhupada sent Prasad. You are like that for us. So thank you so much on that institutional big scale. We all acknowledge you for your wonderful, unique service that's very much needed. And at a personal level, I have to add this note, Mataji, and to all our dear devotees online, because this series of wholesome devotee care, this would not have happened, and we would not be talking like this or getting information from all these experts if Mataji did not validate my understanding after I attended the course. And Ramboru Mataji, she supported, she encouraged, and she insisted that the wholesome devotee care booklet should come out because that is very essential for all the devotees. So if that booklet did not come out, and if the series, if Mataji did not encourage that we have to take up this series and then elaborate on each aspect of it, we would not have been here today. So that's why, at a personal level too, I am deeply grateful to you, Mataji, not just for the support and encouragement for this series to come out, but a big factor in my spiritual journey, where the whole thing was started was we were practicing bhakti, but I personally, and when I spoke with the devotees in the congregation, we felt like we needed a steps tool to be on so we can receive whatever Srila Prabhupada and Acharyas were giving. So I was in search of that, and when I attended your course, Name Your Feeling, Tame Your Mind. Oh, that was a game changer, because that's when I didn't realize myself. Yeah, I didn't realize myself how that I did not even acknowledge the emotional component of our being, our existence. So, but in that class, when the message is loud and clear that we are emotional beings, the emotions will come out. Do not repress them, do not suppress them, regulate it. And you also gave us the tools of how to regulate them in service of Krishna, so we can move forward in service to Krishna. I thought just that, hearing that part, I felt like this is awesome. I found the steps tool I was searching for. So that's where the whole thing started. I had to say all this because we are all trying our best as best as we can spiritually, but this is the information where we don't really find it so easily, Mataji.
I know.
And that's why I really had to bring focus on today's subject matter about emotional health. So on that note, and Aditya and Prabhu already gave all that formal qualifications, expertise about Ramboru Mataji, but I just wanted to add this personal note so all of us can relate to the importance of this subject matter that is being discussed. Quickly, Mataji, so far what we have done is, in this Wholesome Devotee Care series, We have covered the spiritual health, the Krishna Katha, and Harinam. That aspect was covered. Yes, Prabhu, thank you. So that was already covered in the very beginning. It may look like this is just only on the top, the spiritual aspect. It's all pervading, but we have covered that in the first section. And after that, we have covered the physical health also so far, the Ayurvedic aspect and yoga and pranayama aspect. And there's a lot of demand and request for those series to be continued. And I am expecting the same with the emotional health also. And when you permit me to do so, maybe in the beginning of your talk or at the end of the talk, I can wait to share the information that the Karuna Care, the services that Karuna Care is offering to the devotees. I've been keeping that with me all these months, and I'm waiting for this moment to.
Uh-oh.
Let me, I'll message her.
I think she's frozen.
So
She's frozen, but the rest of us aren't.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right.
So
That the song, can I? Yeah.
okay.
So.
Yeah, for a minute we lost you, Mataji, but now you're back.
Oh, sorry, Prabhu. Is it okay now?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So spiritual health was covered and physical health was also covered, and more series would come in Ayurvedic and yoga and pranayama. We all need that. That's the devotee's request. And for emotional health, we will share the Karuna Care website resources and the support that is available based on the request in the congregation. We would contact you, Mataji. You are super busy, but we would just contact you so you can guide us accordingly in the congregation.
Yeah.
Social health has been covered by Gauranga Prabhu. And in this emotional health aspect, today, Rambaru Mataji will be speaking on very fundamental, basic aspects of the emotional health. And the other two components in the emotional health that are related to emotional health. They are spiritual emotions in our Acharya songs, how to spiritualize our emotions. That would be the upcoming session next Sunday by His Holiness Vedavyas Swami Maharaj. And the last one of this series is empathic communication. The reason it came up, this topic came up, was after I received all these courses, we realized how important it is, both in terms of devotee care and emotional health, the empathic communication part. So that would overlap both the emotional health, the spiritual health, devotee care, everything. That session will be by His Holiness Bir Krishna Goswami Maharaj. That would be the week after, just to give you a heads up of what is coming up. And today, by Her Grace Rambaru Mataji, we are asking to touch base 3 important topics that would be very helpful for us, and anything more you think would be helpful for us, Mataji. The first one is the emotional awareness. When we are doing this process of bhakti, there are many emotions that would come out. What to do with those emotions, how to regulate them, and how to use them in the service of Krishna. And that's one thing. Second thing is the beautiful boundaries. When I heard about these boundaries in one of your sessions, I'm like, I thought there are no boundaries in spiritualities. Where is this boundary coming from? That's what my understanding was. But when I knew about the whole thing about boundaries and how the role it plays for the individuals, all of us, for the best part of us to come out, I thought this is wonderful. So about the beautiful boundaries, so we can have healthy and hearty Vaishnava interactions. That's the second topic. And the third one is how to avoid spiritual bypassing. I had no idea of what that spiritual bypassing was and how almost all of us might be doing it, at least a little bit of it. So I'm like, whoa, we all should hear this. So something about the spiritual bypassing and how to avoid it so we can practice bhakti at a deeper level. All to you now, Rambar Mataji. Please go ahead.
Okay.
Sorry, Mataji. I just one request: if devotees here on the call would like to turn on their camera, if you're comfortable, it also
Yes,
makes the
please.
conversation more interactive, more personal. Thank you.
Well, yeah. Thank you very much. I have prepared a presentation so that I can get everything in there. We may have time in the end to do questions. We've started late, so I don't know how much time we have. I'll plow through what I have, and we'll see what we've got time for after that. I like to get questions if there are any. So
Sure.
yeah.
Mataji.
So yeah, the topic, as Mataji has described, is really about emotional and cognitive health. And as she has also mentioned, that most of us don't really know even what an emotion is. When we say the word emotions, like what does it mean? Because we have word emotion and we have word feelings, and we kind of use them interchangeably, but they're really kind of different. They're very close. Emotions are the preconscious or subconscious sensations that are inspired by our nervous system in response to some kind of perceived stimuli. For example, our brain may perceive that we are in danger and start releasing various chemicals in our body and mind that prepare us to fight or run away or freeze or appease in order to protect ourselves. Our heart may start beating, our hands may begin to sweat, and we may have a kind of a fluttery experience in our stomach. Similarly, when our nervous system registers that we are safe, we feel cared for in our surroundings, another set of chemicals is released that inspire us that we can feel grounded and calm. So it's kind of in this pre-conscious state of awareness that we may not yet be able to name the feeling specifically. So we are just aware of these sensations, which we might experience as having high or low energy, or they might be experienced as pleasant or unpleasant sensations. Feelings, on the other hand, are the meaning we consciously assign to the emotional sensations that we experience. And when we speak about the cognitive part of ourselves, that is referring to our intellect, or the part of our brain that thinks, reasons, and remembers. So there is a third aspect of there is a third aspect of our mind, or what we call our subtle body, and that is the part of our mind that desires and wills, thinking, feeling, willing. So that's what our subtle body or our mind is made of. And it's from this part of ourselves that our behavior originates. And although our mind is one of the most important ingredients of our overall physical and emotional health, it is probably the least understood aspect of ourselves. So Krishna says, the mind is restless, turbulent, obstinate, and very strong. And to subdue it is more difficult than controlling the wind. So our minds are typically experienced by us as some kind of background noise, like static from an untuned radio that we've gotten used to simply ignoring so we can get on with the real business or the busyness of managing all the daily crises that come our way. And like robots, we live our lives mindlessly without ever pausing to reflect on what we are doing, why we're doing it, and where we are going. We're just moving. And because we do not pay attention to or even understand the messages coming from our mind, which is the sitting place of our thoughts, feelings, and desires, we end up victimized by our minds, reacting impulsively to life's circumstances rather than as free agents who have the ability to make choices that are our best interests due to being well informed by our minds. There's this famous verse in the Bhagavad Gita. While contemplating the objects of the senses, a person develops attachment for them, and from such attachment lust develops, and from lust anger arises. So as I was playing with this verse, I thought, what if we were to rewrite this verse to say, while contemplating Krishna as the supreme object of our senses, a person develops attachment for him. And from attachment to him, an attitude of service develops. And from an attitude of service, love arises. So in this way, we can see, if we use our mind and our thinking, feeling, and willing for sense objects rather than Krishna's transcendental senses, we have a different result. So the key point here is that by using our thoughts, feelings, and desires, our minds in the service of the Lord, we will develop pure love for the Lord. So naming and understanding our feelings as the inspiring forces underneath all our desires and actions will help us use them rather than being used by them to develop ourselves as servants of the Supreme Self, Krishna. And in this way, our mind will help rather than hinder us in our personal and spiritual growth. Krishna says, all our knowledge gathering senses are grouped around the mind, which is the primary sense organ that enables and inspires all our other senses to act. So our knowledge gathering senses are hearing, touch, sight, smell, taste, and our 5 working senses are our speech, hands, genitals, anus, and legs. And all of these organs are basically manifestations of our mental condition at the moment of our death in our previous lifetime. Krishna says the living entities in this conditioned world are my eternal fragmental parts. Due to conditioned life, they are struggling very hard with the 6 senses, which include the mind. So if we can become aware of our thoughts, feelings, and desires and understand how they inspire our behavior, then we will have greater freedom to choose how our life unfolds rather than being victims of the material energy, which is goodness, passion, or ignorance. If we can learn to identify, understand, and honor rather than repress or inappropriately express our feelings, then we can use them to help us create inspiring, satisfying lives. So I want to pause here just a moment, and I want to ask everybody to just maybe pause. If your screens are open, you can close them and just pay attention to your body and what's coming up, any sensations in your body. And write in the chat any feelings that you're feeling right now. Anything. It's really hard. This is a hard exercise from what I've learned from working with devotees. What are you feeling right now? What kinds of sensations are you experiencing in your body? Settling down. Okay, so that's one thing you're feeling. Slightly anxious. All right, what else? Anything else? Painful, enlivened. All right, what else? Anything else? Relaxed. Okay, hopeful. Sadness. Okay. All right. Vibrations. Happy. So, yeah, peaceful. So it's all really very unique and individual to you, isn't it? All right, let's go on a little bit. So, I'm suspecting that it was a little bit odd for me to ask you this question, right? I mean, it was, everybody kind of paused a minute and say, well, what is she asking for? And I'm guessing it was not such an easy task. And yet we are always greeting each other with, how are you doing? How are you feeling? And we're not pausing to think what we are asking or being asked by other people by this question. So we robotically respond by saying something like, well, I'm great. Thanks. How are you? Everything's fine. I'm really busy these days. And this kind of is a symptom of how unaware of our feelings we really are. We just really are not used to speaking that language. And we instinctively know that if we were to stop and give the person asking us how we are with a detailed, unedited response to their how are you question, really telling them the truth of how we were, they would probably never ask us again were we to really respond. They're like, oh my goodness, too much information. I don't want to ask them that again because they might tell me what they're really feeling. And even though we know that aside from our physical health, our emotional state is one of the most important aspects of our lives because it impacts everything else in our lives, our physical health included, we are mostly unaware that our inner lives are often filled with sadness, disappointment, anxiety, irritation, frustration, and stress. So now why is that? Because being aware of our feelings is often really inconvenient. They kind of get in the way of our busy lives, so we do our best to ignore them. And the problem with doing that is if we ignore or suppress our feelings, they only become stronger, especially the really powerful emotions that we unconsciously carry. And then they end up spilling over into everything else we do, whether we like it or not. Hurt feelings don't vanish on their own. They simply get buried in our minds and our bodies and express themselves in unhealthy mental and physical ways like chronic anxiety, depression, stress, panic attacks, anger, outbursts, and all kinds of chronic physical diseases. Now, feelings are information. They're messages from our soul letting us know what's going on inside of us. When we pay attention to our feelings and understand what they are telling us, then we can make better decisions how to act in life-affirming rather than self-destructive ways. Now, after 3 decades of research and practical experience at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, specialists identified 5 skills needed to effectively manage our emotions. And Ujjwala, she mentioned those 5 skills. They were very impressive to her. There are other models, but this one is especially helpful. We need to first recognize our own emotions and those of others, not just in the things we think, feel, and say, but in facial expressions, body language, voice tones, and other nonverbal signals. Number 2, we need to understand those feelings and determine where they come from. What experiences actually cause them, and then see how they are influencing our behavior. Number 3, we need to label or name with a nuanced vocabulary these emotions. We need to learn what words that name our feelings. Most of us don't have a very robust emotional vocabulary. Number 4, we need to learn how to express our feelings in accordance with particular social and cultural contexts in ways that inform and invites empathy from the listener. And 5, we need to regulate, or it's another word, it's a kind of fancy word for managing our emotions rather than let them manage us by finding practical strategies for dealing with what we and others feel. So the 5 skills have been neatly rolled into an acronym called the RULER, R-U-L-E-R, recognize, understand, label, express, and regulate our emotions. Learning to use our emotions to engage in heart-connecting relationships requires tons and tons of practice. It's actually yoga, the yoga of listening. It's a discipline, which means failing a whole lot of the time, then getting back up a million times and trying again and again, and keep moving forward towards our target of becoming increasingly self-aware, sensitive, and compassionate persons. So the first thing we need to do to be able to use our feelings as information is to recognize that we're experiencing an emotion. And that might mean being aware that we are experiencing an increase or decrease of energy in our bodies. And that those sensations may be pleasant or unpleasant. At this stage, there's no name. We're just noticing, what's going on with me? I'm feeling butterflies in my stomach. I'm feeling myself shaking. I'm feeling my heart racing. What's going on with me? And so if we pay closer to the bodily sensations, we may ask ourselves, what are they about? What are they telling us? Is there a need that is being met or unmet right now? Sometimes it's a positive feeling. We might feel in our body a sensation of lightness or a kind of emerging joy or increased energy. And it's not always what we would call negative. It could be a different sensation. So we want to ask, what is that about? What is really happening to me right now? Is there a need being met or unmet? Is there a value of ours that's being validated or maybe even violated? This is where the boundaries come into, am I feeling violated? I feel like someone is oppressing or exerting power over me that doesn't feel healthy or comfortable. So asking ourselves what the underlying meaning of these sensations are really important, because from there we find a name. We need to label or name the feeling. There are many degrees and flavors of emotion. For example, a mild form of anger can be experienced as annoyance or frustrated. A very strong anger feeling may be experienced as rage, violent rage. Our face may feel hot and become red. Our heart again may race or pump faster. So being able to recognize and understand and label these sensations means pausing to go inside and making use, tuning in to this information that's coming up. We're not used to doing that, so it does take some practice. In the beginning, it's like, I don't even feel anything. And so it does take some practice to really listen to ourselves, our bodies. Once we have understood and named our feelings, then we need to choose how best to use them. Are we going to express them in that moment to the person in front of us? Will we wait and explore them with ourselves and choose a different time or place to express them? Will expressing our feelings in this particular moment, at this particular place, in this particular circumstance be helpful or harmful to ourselves and those around us? So these first three skills in the ruler tool, they all have something in common. They are all about being aware of our inner experience of our emotions. And so far, they don't require us to take a risk, because nobody at this point knows what's going on inside of us but us. But when it comes to expressing our emotions, that can be kind of frightening, because we don't know if, when we express our emotions or our feelings, we're going to be judged or supported by those who are listening. And there's no guarantee that once we have expressed our feelings that we won't be rejected for having them, right? I think we all have perhaps this experience that, gosh, I've tried to share something and, people are, not at all affirming us. So I'm not going to do that again. I'm not going to share my feelings. So it's not just the feelings that we hide. It's what's causing those feelings. For example, people who have been abused or harassed often never utter a word about it or call out their abusers because they don't think anyone will believe them, or they feel some kind of fear, some kind of retaliation. And in many ways, suffering in silence is as damaging as the abuse. Having no spaces where we have permission to feel keeps our feelings bottled up inside, leading us to self-doubt, low self-worth, and extreme loneliness, which, by the way, is the main cause of mental illness, isolation and loneliness. And when those feelings boil over, as suppressed emotions always will do, they often get expressed as violent rage, which only makes things worse. Or they express themselves in physical pain or illness, some kind of dis-ease. That's the word, dis-ease. Ease means calm and peace, and the opposite of that would be dis-ease, not calm. So such unexpressed emotions often turn into self-hatred and some kind of addiction, like addiction to food or sex or work or intoxication or even sugar. They did a study once on sugar, and it's a few grains away from crack cocaine. It's such an addiction people get to sugar. So the more skilled we become at saying what we feel, the more control we will have over ourselves. So why don't we say what we feel? Is it shame? Is it to protect ourselves? Or do we sense that the people around us want us to keep our feelings to ourselves for their own reasons? The truth is, we've all experienced this. It can be really scary to hear other people express their feelings because it may mean we have to accept some hard truths about ourselves. Somebody might be angry with us, and now they tell us why they're angry, and that can be really surprising. It can be hurtful, and we don't know what to do with it. And it may mean we are feeling obliged to take some action in response to how another person feels. We might have to grow or change our behavior in order to rise to the feelings that a person has expressed to us. We may have to make some changes. And that's kind of the last thing any of us want to do, is have to change our behavior. So we don't really want to know what other people are thinking or feeling in relationship to us. And so we typically hide our unpleasant feelings behind a show of gladness by covering up any emotions we associate with sadness and vulnerability in an effort to show the world that we are detached and unaffected, at least superficially. So some of you may be thinking by now that giving ourselves and others permission to feel means giving ourselves and others a license to complain and yell and impulsively act out our emotions. And some people think this kind of venting means they're being themselves. They're, well, I'm just being myself. That's authentically me. But habitual, unhealthy methods of expression like yelling, gossiping, verbal and physical aggression, among many other behaviors, typically only does harm to ourselves and other people. That is not what I'm talking about in terms of true heart connecting expression of our feelings. The key skill involved in enabling a person to express their emotions is the ability to listen, not just hearing, but to be conspicuously open, patient, and sympathetic to whatever is being said. No crossed arms, no moving around, no looking away, looking at our cell phones while someone is trying to share their feelings. And so we need to become what we call the emotion scientist, who embodies our words, body language, facial expressions, and eye contact that communicate, I am here for you. I am not judging. I want to understand you and be present to you at this very moment. You've got my attention. So an emotional scientist is someone who accepts all emotions as information. They see all emotions as temporary. They are open, curious, and reflective. They are in a learner mode. They're just curious and being investigators. They want to get clear, specific information. And they have this mindset of growth, like eternal growth. This is just a learning experience. An emotion judge, on the other hand, is someone who is critical, closed, and actually ignores emotions. They are in a knower mode, and they attribute emotions to people rather than asking them how they feel. They will say, oh, he feels bad or feels sorry for himself, rather than finding out what do they actually feel. And an emotional judge will just clump emotions or decide that they're either positive or negative, whereas an emotional scientist just recognizes emotions as information. They're not really good or bad, they're just energy, and they're there to tell us something. An emotional judge has a kind of a fixed mindset and hasn't any ability to be flexible. So deciding when, where, and how we express our emotions is something we have to decide in every time, place, and circumstance. And this requires a great deal of self-awareness. Suppose, for whatever reason, you're really feeling awful today. Are you going to unload on everyone you meet? Or go into a temporary denial? Or just carry on? These are strategies, they're kind of second nature, and they will work for a while. We can hold our feelings, stuff them for a while, and carry on with our work. We can also have the habit of exploding on everybody, but over time, they don't really serve us. And this is when we have to ask ourselves or have some strategies in place to know, how do we regulate? or manage these emotions, because we have to keep going. It's not necessarily possible for us to just unplug and focus on them all the time. So this tool, like the ruler tool, recognizing we're having emotional sensation, understanding what the sensation means, labeling the sensation as a specific feeling, and choosing how we will express the emotion in a healthy way is really helpful. If you have that tool in your toolbox, next time you're feeling anger, what is this? What level of energy, and what am I going to do to express it or not? Now, sometimes sharing with other people is too difficult. I get that. It's not that everybody is trustworthy to hold your vulnerable feelings. So that's kind of an assessment that you have to make over time with people, especially if you're in a small community where everybody knows everybody. You can kind of test people out to see, when you share even a little teeny bit, whether they're now going to start teaching and advising and judging. And if that's the case, that's not the person I'm going to share my heart with. But in those cases, even if you can't seem to find anybody to express your feelings verbally, you can do this in writing. Many of us have the experience of writing something in a journal or a letter that we felt impossible to say out loud, and that's okay. In fact, they've done research on the benefits of journaling. And there's a professor from University of Texas named Professor Pennebaker, and he did a whole research on the benefits of the detriment of keeping secrets on causing illness, and that when we transform our feelings and thoughts into language, how our health dramatically improves. In his study, he found that expressing emotion benefits us in the following ways. It significantly drops our visits to the doctor, increases our immune function, lowers blood pressure. There's a long-term improvement in mood, reduction in stress, even higher grades in college students, and then less absenteeism in work. So Pennebaker concluded that suppressing traumatic experiences is actually debilitating, while confiding them to someone else or writing them down brings great relief to the stress and pain underneath them. So when we don't know what we're feeling, it leaves us helpless to act. When we do identify and express our emotions in writing and speech, it gives us the ability to slow things down, develop some insight, and choose a course of action that lines up with our values and the kind of person we want to be. If, on the other hand, we act impulsively to suppress or react to our emotions, then our life begins to feel somewhat out of control. Now, it might be helpful to think of our brains as having two parts. One part is a rational thinking part, which we can call the upstairs brain. And this upstairs brain thinks through problems, plans, and makes good choices. It's the critical thinking part of our brain. The other part of our brain is more emotionally reactive, which we can call the downstairs brain. This is known as the limbic system, or the survival part of our brain. And this is where the fight, flight, freeze response comes from. It is the emotional part of our brain where that sort of lights up. Both parts are needed, but when our brain is stuck in the downstairs or the emotional part of our brain, it can be hard to think clearly, and we're often more reactive. But when we give a name to our emotions, it's like we're connecting those two parts together so they can work together to solve problems. Now, in everyday life, this means I need to start using I feel statements. An I feel statement is simple. You just say, I feel, followed by a feeling word. So if you want to become more emotionally intelligent, it's really important to build a rich emotional vocabulary, which most of us don't have. So you can do a Google search and find some lists of feelings. However, if you can at least memorize or learn, become familiar with 6 basic fundamental feelings, you can start to learn how to recognize and label or name your feelings. So these 6 basic emotions are sad, mad, or anger. Some of these rhyme so you can remember. Sad, mad, glad, which is happy, all the different happy, joy, content. And we would rhyme it by saying afraid, sad, mad, glad, afraid, but it's really fear, afraid, surprise, and disgust. So if you can practice checking in with your pleasant and unpleasant feelings when they arise and assign a meaning to them, it will greatly help you transcend them, which is the healthiest way of managing them, rather than suppressing or inappropriately expressing them in harmful ways. Just first of all, pause. I have a sensation. Find a label for it, and then the next thing is deciding what do you want to do with it. But just by pausing and naming can make a huge difference in overcoming our tendency to be impulsive and reactive. Just awareness is huge. So just recognizing, understanding, and labeling can be enough to begin our healing process, because deep down in the core of our hearts, we have an inner wisdom coming from the Lord in our hearts who has all the answers and knows just what to do. When we simply pause long enough to notice our intense emotions, we may be surprised to see that they often naturally dissipate on their own. They just go away. And what we thought was so major and overwhelming, just by naming and pausing and being aware for a moment, they often just subside and become less intense and more manageable. So now I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about grief feelings, which is typically what's underneath our unpleasant feelings. When we think of the word grief, we typically associate with sadness due to the loss of a loved one following a death. That's usually what people think, because people are not very well educated around what grief really is. Grief is anything we think and feel following any loss, whether it's a person, a place, or even a thing that gave our life meaning and purpose. Grief is kind of a mixture of feelings. It's not just sadness. It can be experienced as anger, depression, panic attacks, confusion, numbness, apathy, lethargy, and almost any other sort of physical or emotional sensation. For example, eating too much or too little, going on these binges, or starvation diets, sleeping too much or not sleeping enough. These can be caused by underlying grief that's not been processed. We grieve following a divorce, when we are diagnosed with a terminal illness, when our children grow up and leave home, when we lose our job or our home due to a natural disaster, or when we lose anything we deeply value. The degree of grief we experience will depend on the context and the degree of attachment we have for the particular person, place, or thing that we lost. So grief is what we feel when we are separated from any person, place, or thing that we love. Without love, there would be no grief. And this makes grief the flip side of love. So you cannot have love without experiencing grief when the object of your love is taken away. And in the same way that love is a deeply meaningful emotional experience because it transcends time and space, grief is also a complex, mysterious, and meaningful emotional experience that affects us deeply in our hearts and our very soul. And therefore, grief specialists like Alan Wolfeld, he would consider grief to be a soul-based journey. It's not just an experience, it's a process of moving through a sudden change, which has caused a loss. Now, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, he showed by example how a person experiences deep grief when feeling separated from the object of their love. Well, in his case, he felt deep separation from Lord Jagannath, the Lord in his heart. For us conditioned souls, our feelings of grief and separation from the object of our love can be so unbearable that we think we want to give up our life. And that is when it becomes complicated. And when grief becomes complicated, it means that our natural, normal, necessary grief feelings have gotten stuck or are denied in a way that prevents us from moving through the natural process of healing and reconciling our losses. The natural, normal, necessary response to grief is the outward expression of grief. When we cry, talk about our grief, or in any way express our anger, sadness, shock, or other thoughts or feelings about loss, we are doing what's called in English mourning, mourning, not like in the early morning day. Expressing our grief through mourning is necessary because it helps us come to terms with our loss and make the transition to our new way of being. So it's a process. Grief, it starts like a journey, and it brings us to our new level of being. We become changed by the grief and loss process. Particularly in our Western culture, we have internalized the belief that expressing our grief openly is socially unacceptable. And as a result, we feel pressured to keep our grief feelings to ourselves. Most of us have had the experience when we have expressed our grief feelings that people tend to say things like, "Suck it up, be strong and carry on, don't look back, move forward, and being sad doesn't help, just let it go." So we have become so brainwashed by the pleasure-seeking, materialistic culture surrounding us that we assume we are entitled to be happy all the time and that emotional and spiritual pain should be avoided at all costs. And in this way, we believe that grief and mourning are some kind of illness that needs medical treatment. The truth is, grief and mourning are the normal, natural, necessary response to loss. It's natural to grieve the loss of a person we care about. It's natural to grieve the loss of some aspect of our health, like the loss of a body part. It's natural to grieve the loss of our home or valued belongings. And it's natural to grieve the loss of a safe, predictable world due to a natural disaster or a sudden change in our life circumstances. We've had so much loss with this COVID in the last couple of years, and there's so many people who are confused about their grief feelings, and it has affected devotees as well. And that's natural and normal for us to have those feelings. So, due to immutable time, life is always changing, and whenever there is change, there will naturally be loss. And whenever there is loss, then grief naturally follows right behind it, and there is nothing we can do to stop it. It's just the way life is. So in the same way that time, change, and loss are a natural part of life, grief and mourning are a natural, normal part of life as well. Krishna says, "Time I am, the great destroyer of the worlds, and I have come to destroy all people. Both by rising and setting, the sun decreases the duration of life for everyone." So expressing our feelings through talking, writing, singing, or the arts, any of the arts, is the key to healing our grief. If our grief becomes complicated or stuck, we may need to work with a trusted grief counselor and the care of loving friends to help us reconcile our grief and find new meaning and purpose in our lives. To help a grieving person, because I know that's a big problem, we see people who are going through a crisis or a grief experience and we don't know what to say. And so we say all kinds of things that we heard other people say, and it may not be helpful. But if we want to help a grieving person, it's essential to meet them where they are in their grief process. Provide them a sacred space where they can feel deeply listened to and understood without minimizing their grief, dismissing it, or judging them. And of course, all of what they share must be kept confidential. And this is what it means to reveal our mind in confidence in Rupa Goswami's 6 loving exchanges, engaging in a sacred confidential conversation with someone that we trust will not share what we say from our hearts with anyone else. Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh explains that deep listening is the kind of listening that can help relieve the suffering of another person. You listen with only one purpose, to help them empty their heart. Best-selling author of Mind Over Medicine, Dr. Lisa Rankin, affirms that every time you tell your story and someone else who cares bears witness to it, you turn off the body's toxic stress hormones and flip on relaxation responses that release healing hormones like oxytocin, dopamine, nitric oxide, and endorphins. Not only does this turn on the body's innate self-repair mechanisms and function as preventative medicine, if you're sick, it also relaxes your nervous system and helps heal your mind of depression, anxiety, fear, anger, and feelings of disconnection. So one of the greatest risk factors for our becoming complicated, our grief becoming complicated, are our misunderstanding of our religious beliefs. And while faith may give many grievers comfort, some grievers end up suppressing their normal and natural grief feelings because a designated counselor, mentor, religious leader, teacher, or fellow congregant repeatedly says to them that their ongoing anxiety and depression are signs that they don't have faith in God. Grievers are often given religious platitudes instead of truly empathetic support. Even a person who is a serious and sincere spiritual practitioner may feel offended or shut down by such messages. What they really need is a chance to express how they are feeling and receive unconditional care, support, and validation. And all the cliches that you can give a person prevent any real conversation and care from happening. Here's some familiar things that we may say, you may recognize that you say, or you've heard someone say to you when you've experienced a loss or they've experienced a loss. Oh, God wouldn't give you more than you can handle. That's really a cliche. He or she is watching over you. God has a plan for you. She or he is in a better place. It's just a test of your faith. Everything happens for a reason. This is all part of God's plan. God works in mysterious ways. This happened to bring you to God. God needed a special angel. I'm praying for you. Now, prayer, we might be thinking, oh, this is a great thing to do. I mean, people should feel really grateful that we're praying for them. However, if someone is feeling a deep sense of grief and despair, prayer may be welcome, but it may also be seen as insufficient. Telling someone that I am praying for you is not the same as saying to them, I'm here to help you and listen to you. And grievers often say they feel abandoned or dismissed by being told that you are praying for them. Because it's like, okay, I'm doing that. I don't need to give you my time, which is the most valuable gift you can give a person. It's just your time. Buddhist teacher and psychotherapist John Welwood, he noticed a widespread tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. And this behavior dynamic he identified as something he called spiritual bypassing. He's actually the father of this term. And he explains, when we are spiritually bypassing, we often use the goal of awakening or liberation to rationalize premature transcendence, trying to rise above the raw and messy side of our humanness before we have fully faced and made peace with it. And then we tend to use absolute truth to disparage or dismiss relative human needs or feelings or psychological problems, relational difficulties, and developmental deficits. One might, for example, try to practice non-attachment by dismissing one's need for love, but this only drives the need underground so that it often becomes unconsciously acted out in possibly harmful ways instead. This dynamic may account for some of the challenges in our spiritual communities. The notion that our thoughts and feelings should be ignored because they are simply a product of Maya, or the material energy. While this notion can be helpful when we are actively engaged in trying to focus on our devotional practices like hearing, chanting, deity worship, etc., when it comes to managing our day-to-day life situations, these same ideas can be used to suppress and deny feelings or concerns that really do need our attention. Spiritual bypassing shows up most often as problems in our relationships. If we were a yogi meditating alone in a cave, our psychological wounding might not show up so much because our focus would be entirely on our spiritual practices and not be aggravated by our relational wounds. It is in relationships that our unresolved psychological issues tend to show up most intensely, and that's because psychological wounds are always relational. They form in and through our relationship with those who took care of us when we were children. The basic human wound, which is prevalent in the modern world, is the deep sense that we are not worthy and that we are not loved. And not feeling loved or cared for by a child is actually traumatic. For a child's developing a highly sensitive nervous system, it can't handle that. It's meant to be cared for at that age. And as we internalize how we were parented, our capacity to value ourselves, which is also the basis for valuing others, becomes damaged. And Wellwood calls this a relational wound, or the wound of the heart. In contrast to the indigenous culture of Vedic India, where women and children were protected and cared for, modern child rearing leaves most people suffering from symptoms of insecure attachment, self-hatred, disembodiment, lack of grounding, chronic insecurity, anxiety, overactive minds, lack of a basic trust, and a deep sense of inner deficiency. So most of us suffer from an extreme degree of alienation and disconnection that was unknown in earlier times because, families were more functional and, it was just acceptable and actually very much attended to that, raising children was a serious, serious responsibility. So children got the attention that they needed. Most of us turn to Krishna consciousness, at least in part, as a way of trying to overcome the pain of our psychological and relational wounding. Yet we are often in denial or unconscious about the nature or extent of this wounding. We only know that something isn't right and we want to be free from suffering. We may turn towards Krishna consciousness from a wounded place that we're not even aware of, seeking to feel better, but then unintentionally use our spiritual practices as a substitute for facing our emotional and relationship issues. For example, a devotee can practice Krishna consciousness for decades, which can greatly enhance their lives, and speak about the eternal bliss of our true nature as eternal souls, but then struggle to trust that reality when their psychological wounds are triggered. We may talk about having compassion for others, meanwhile shame ourselves for not living up to our spiritual ideals. People with depressive tendencies due to having grown up with a lack of loving attunement in childhood can have a hard time valuing themselves. And when they cannot perfectly live up to the idealized faith and practices, their shame and guilt over this becomes their main focus in spiritual life. Now, devotee association or sadhu sangha often becomes a place where people play out their unresolved family issues by projecting them onto gurus and religious leaders, seeing them as parental figures, and then trying to win their love or rebelling against them, just like you would with your parents. Sibling rivalry and competition with other sangha members over who is their teacher's favorite is also really common. And so spiritual practices can be used to avoid uncomfortable feelings and unresolved life situations, which then reinforce a tendency towards coldness or disengagement or interpersonal distance. And this makes it impossible to relate directly with our feelings and express them personally and in a transparent way. It can be quite threatening to face our woundedness or emotional dependency or fundamental need for love. Wellwood proposed that we need to first become fully human before we are able to transcend our humanity. We are not just human beings learning to realize our eternal, wise, joyful nature as parts and parcels of Krishna, but we are spiritual beings having a human experience. We are marginal energy, which means we have one foot in both the spiritual and the material realm. And so both our human and spiritual natures must work together to realize ourselves while we are in these bodies. Both aspects of ourselves must be nourished in order to be mentally balanced and whole. While the result of our Krishna conscious practices are that we realize ourselves, the result of our becoming a fully developed human being is our capacity to engage in heart-connecting relationships. And this means we are able to be fully transparent with others, meanwhile appreciating and taking interest in how another's experience is different from ours. And this ability for open expressiveness and deep attunement is very rare in this world. It's especially difficult if we are relationally wounded. If we can hold a perspective that includes both our human and our spiritual developmental needs, then we will not use absolute truth to belittle relative truth. And while it may be true that we are not our bodies, we are living within our human bodies. So if we ignore or neglect our physical, intellectual, emotional, social, and spiritual needs, it can cause problems in our devotional lives. And being clear about what we need is one of the most important principles of healthy communication in relationships. The great paradox of being both human and made in the image and likeness of God is that we are both dependent and not dependent on Krishna. We are simultaneously one with and separate from God. Achintya abheda bheda tattva. Prabhupada explains, every one of us is an expansion of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. This accounts for unity and diversity. There are diverse manifestations, but at the same time, they are one in Vishnu. Everything is an expansion of Vishnu's energy. So part of us is completely dependent on people to satisfy our basic human needs like food and shelter and water, clothing, love, belonging, self-esteem, inspiration, and help with our personal development. The spiritual part of us is not dependent on anything in this material world, and that is the absolute truth. Our human nature is under the laws of relative truth. Naturally then, because our spiritual and human nature is completely interwoven, you can't really separate it. So the more we realize ourselves as part of Krishna, the more deeply we recognize our interconnectedness with all living beings. So we can be both attached and non-attached, because non-attachment is about our eternal nature. And although attachment in the Bhagavad Gita suggests that grasping and clinging to temporary things is an obstacle for our pursuing self-realization, in order to grow into a healthy human being, we need to have secure attachments in the positive psychological sense, which means having close emotional ties to other people that promote connectedness, grounded embodiment, and well-being. So how can we know if we are spiritual bypassing? Spiritual bypassing is the tendency to use spiritual teachings or practices to avoid acknowledging or accepting parts of ourselves. These unacceptable parts of ourselves are kept in our unconscious and become what is called a shadow. Prabhupada used to give the example of a wedding party that was on a boat, and the boatman was rowing the whole night. And in the morning, everyone looked out of the boat and realized they were still in the same place that they started the night before, because they had forgotten to remove the anchor. So we are the boatman, and the boat is our physical body, and the oars are our false ego or false self, our shadow. That they are the anchor. And we can't make spiritual progress if we are anchored down by our false ego or our shadow, unacknowledged parts of ourself. So spiritual bypassing is the brain's poor attempt to protect us from our pain, because we believe that some emotions are unacceptable and we shouldn't have them. So we only allow ourselves to focus on our perceived positive or pleasant emotions. In reality, emotions are just energy. They are neither bad or good. They are simply messages from our body and minds that let us know what we need in the moment. Some signs that we are spiritual bypassing are not focusing on the here and now, living in a pseudo-spiritual realm much of the time, overemphasizing the positive and avoiding the negative, being self-righteous about the concept of enlightenment, being overly detached, being overly idealistic, having feelings of entitlement, exhibiting frequent anger, feeling irritated or annoyed when presented with facts that contradict a person's self-image, attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors, being overly compassionate, pretending that everything is okay when it's not. In other words, spiritual bypassing shows up when We ignore anything about ourselves we perceive to be unacceptable and only focus on attitudes and behaviors that we consider to be acceptable to ourselves and other people. Nobody is all good or all bad. A spiritually mature person acknowledges that all of us have strengths and weaknesses, and that's what it means to be human. We tell ourselves that we are too sensitive to face our painful feelings because they make us too uncomfortable. We minimize our humanness by believing that anger, fear, shame, regret, and guilt are inferior emotions when they're as much a part of being human as joy and love and compassion and gratitude. We blame others for making us feel a certain way instead of exploring what unhealed wound in us is being triggered by a particular person, place, or thing. Feeling triggered is a helpful hint that we have a wound that needs our attention and some healing. Most of us have engaged in spiritual bypassing because we were not aware of it. Now that we are aware of it, we can take steps to take advantage of this knowledge in order to heal ourselves. Facing our fears and integrating our shadow is part of the spiritual journey. Being aware of our grief pain as we engage in the healing power of our spiritual faith and practices will help us see reality and live a spiritually fulfilling life. Sometimes all it takes is for us to acknowledge our weaknesses with honesty and humility in order to discover our spiritual strengths. And all that is to say that seeking and maintaining our interpersonal relationships is a basic need of all human beings. All of us need the acceptance, presence, and comfort of others to feel psychologically and socially safe and well. We are all inherently social creatures. We are hardwired for connection with others. If we're unable to communicate well, make friends, or get help when we need it among like-minded devotees, this will have a significant impact on our well-being and ability to achieve our personal and spiritual goals. So I will stop there. And I know that you asked me to talk about boundaries, but I'm also really, really aware of the time. So you tell me where you want me to go. If you want me to ask, I have so huge something in the chat there, but I will, I guess, I have to address that later. But can you maybe give them my WhatsApp and they can send it?
Sure, Mataji. First, one thing I'm realizing is the 2-3 questions that I've asked were really, they're densely packed, and I'm sorry, I see your effort to put all that information in this short time. They're all very important and dense, and I see all the 5-week courses now are condensed to this short time. They're all, each one of them are important, but you have only a little time to express all that. Apologies for that, Mataji. So with the time we have now, my humble opinion is that if the devotees can express now, ask you the questions, then the help will be maximum, Mataji. If that's
please.
okay with you and everybody.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
And before that, to all the devotees, this is not the end of the session, because we see there is so much to know. And we have to give the time that it needs so we can understand and let that information sink in and come out as practice. So we can do more of this in the future as Mataji availability permits us. But for time being, please go ahead with the questions, and Mataji, please answers from you. Thank you.
And I'd love to see your faces behind these screens. You have no idea how hard it is to look at names on a black square. Yes, it's so nice to see you. People.
Hare Krishna, thank you. Very, very clear presentation, and your method of speaking is so soothing to the heart, and presence is very healing. You were just what I needed to hear today, so thank you.
Oh, so nice to see you, Krishna Priya. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hare Krishna Mataji. So thank you so much. It was like, for me personally, this was like kind of like a step into like a whole world, unexplored world. And I was actually thinking, like, the point you made about like emotional vocabulary, and I was just thinking, like, my emotional vocabulary is actually so weak. Like, I didn't even know how to like even identify my emotions and then give a name to it, and that entire concept of ruler. It just like is such a powerful tool, which I feel that I have not even like touched upon, and I'm just realizing the potency of like this tool, how much it can make a difference in my life. So this was just excellent, and I'm so inspired to actually go deeper into this, and like personally for my own emotional health and how it can be such a asset to my life. So thank you so much
Thank
for that. It
you.
was like so excellent. Thank
Yeah,
you,
I'm glad it was helpful. Thank you. I see there's Rati is their hand up.
Yes.
Is that
Yes,
Radhika?
Hare Krishna Mataji. Thank you so much. It's really, for me, this is something, I'm very grateful to Chula Mataji and Aditya Narayan Prabhuji for, bringing up all these things. It makes a huge, huge difference. And also, I have seen like, among the devotees, they say, oh, you don't talk about anything else other than Krishna, that kinds of makes people not to express their feelings and share the things. They say, oh, it has to be all related about Krishna. If you're talking, it is Prajalpa or like, something, that discourages people talking about themselves, sharing, friendships. We don't know, like on a devotee platform, we know like how the devotee is doing, chanting, reading, giving the classes, but they don't know what's happening with that person. Feelings, grief or happiness, there's nothing to share. They feel that is so irrelevant in a devotee community. And a lot of times we see there is some kind of misunderstandings or something like, a person is going through something, or the kind they are acting, they think, oh, he has long way to go. He has to chant and cleanse his conditioning. But, we don't address this humanly needs.
I
For
know.
me, this class like made me think, and everything falls in its place. Very grateful for this class, and I look forward for attending your classes or workshops, whatever Ujjwala Mataji directs all of us. But I see this, and I know some of our Richmond congregation members are missing today because they're traveling and kind of other commitments. But I'll make sure this recording is seen by every devotee and understand and address these, that we are humans and then devotees, and the spiritual bypassing is a wonderful, wonderful thing you explained today. When I was listening to you, I was like, oh my God, this is what I was, trying to put things, give it some nomenclature to this. I didn't know I had this bits and pieces, and I tried to express this, but it looks like no one understands that. But this is so perfect, and I feel it's Srila Prabhupada's mercy, like, whatever I had in the doubt, and you have come up and, explained. Thank you so much. It's such a wonderful, much, much needed for all the devotees to understand. It's not always about listening to Krishna relationship. Yes, that's very important. But again, there are other aspects in the devotee's life as a human. Like, we need this. Thank you so much.
Well,
I
and
really appreciate it.
just to clarify, God's in our heart. God's in our heart. And we're not the only people who know this. And people who are into heart connecting relationships realize, and if you're doing this as a profession like I am, you realize when two people engage in heart connecting relationship, that means the God in my heart is connecting to the God in your heart. God shows up. Something special happens there. And there is a saying, not only in Christian literature, but in our literature, wherever two or more are gathered in his name, there he is in the midst. So this is very pleasing to Krishna, for us to share our hearts, reveal our minds. It's one of the 6 loving exchanges. Rupa Goswami has outlined it. We have not really lived up to it or understood it. And if we could do this, everything would change. In our temples and our communities would change if we knew how to do this. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you,
Krishna
Madhuma.
Shakti. Haribol. Krishna Shakti. Your hands up.
Hi, Hare Krishna, Jai Rambaru Prabhu. Thank you so much for your enlightening lecture.
Welcome.
I have a question. You spoke a little bit about grieving and the grief process, and you mentioned that if the grieving process is not, if it's beyond the normal process, then someone, should look for professional help. So my first question is, what is the normal period of grieving, and does that vary for different losses, different types of losses? You mentioned a loss of a job, or a loss of a loved one who passed away, or someone who goes away. What about someone who goes away for a while, or who is, who gets incarcerated or something like that? And then what would be the normal timing for grieving for a process? And then would you have any referral? Because, a lot of devotees are going through these processes of grieving. We've seen a lot of people passing away in our community, right?
Yeah.
During various illnesses, COVID or not COVID, regardless, aging, we are all aging. So would you have any referral
Mm-hmm.
for those? Those are my
Okay.
questions.
Okay, well, as I said in the talk, the level of grief you will have will be commiserate or dependent on how attached and how much love attachment you have for them. So, you might be married to someone and have a deep attachment, somebody you've lived with for 45, 50 years, whereas somebody who's a congregational member may know the person and feel grief, but it will not be the same as the person who was married to them. So it depends on the relationship, and grief is unique for everyone. Also, there's no time limit. Everybody does this differently. And while the grief experience feelings don't really ever go away, they become integrated into the person we're becoming. So you through the process of working our grief, it's a process. It doesn't get healed just by ignoring it. It's still there. And I know this because I'm living with my 93-year-old mother, whose firstborn child died at the age of 3 days as a blue baby. She never grieved it. It was just, everybody said, don't worry, you can have another one. That's what everybody says. She was a young girl of 18, and now she's 93. And when I started to study this sort of thing and became a professional, my mom said to me, every year on Keith, she still had the name of her son like 70 years ago. Every year I feel this sadness that comes, and I look at the calendar. It's the exact day that he died. And so I don't know what to make of it. So I said, Mom, why don't you make a ritual? It's not that when someone dies, we should forget them. We should remember them. It's the process of remembering them. He was a real person. And me and my sister, we did not our whole lives become aware till later that my brother who died was still living as a ghost in the unconscious memory of my parents, who never spoke about him. And had they gave him a place at the table and honored him as a real being who really lived, and their grief process would have been different. Now she lights a candle whenever there's someone who has died. My father, she has a lot of those because at her age she has a lot of. So having a ritual, and everybody does this different, is a great way to honor and soothe one's grief and transform the memory. The relationship doesn't go away, it changes, that's all. Secondly, as far as resources, we have a website called karunacare.iskon.org. There's a tab on that core. There's a couple things. You have support groups there. I have been doing, in the last year particularly, in the last year I've been doing various grief support groups. I don't know if you remember, we had several suicides at the beginning of the year. I spent 6 months with Gita Nagari doing a process with their entire community, a grief support process, working through, because it's a process, it's a journey. And it totally brought their community together. They didn't ever talk to each other as a community, living together in the same house, next door to each other in the same ashram, never looking at each other. And now they have to go on Zoom to talk. and it was wonderful. So I have been doing, I just did a divorce grief support group since January, transformed a lot of devotees who felt ostracized, rejected, shunned because they had had a divorce, you know. And then I am just almost finishing another generalized grief support. Another one is starting November the 7th, and we only take a limited amount of people. So if you want to get on that, you need to register. You need to go to the website, to the support group, and plug into the November 7th. And then when that's full, we'll put you on a wait list, or somebody, if they don't get in on that one, I have other devotees I'm training to facilitate these groups, because it's just so healing. And I can't tell you, I was experimenting to see if the devotees would thrive in this process. And every single group started with lots of pain and grief and crying. And it was just a wonderful place, safe place. And they ended up with friends that they could talk to, because they now know the language, and they're all across the world. $180 for an hour. And if you don't have health insurance, good luck.